On the 7th of October 2023, nearly 1,200 Israelis were killed and 251 taken hostage in an attack led by Hamas. Israel responded with 2 years of genocidal warfare against Palestinians.
On this day 2 years ago, Israelis were left with shock, grief, and questions about how one of the world's most advanced militaries failed to protect them.
And Palestinians braced themselves as Israeli leaders vowed a destructive and indiscriminate retaliation.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
Western governments immediately pledged their support for Israel's war, and turnout among Israeli reservists hit an unprecedented 120%.
We stand with you. We stand with Israel.
Je condamne avec la plus grande fermeté l'attaque insensée menée par la Hamas contre Israël.
And my administration's support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering.
I thought it was very important to come personally to bring the solidarity of the Italian government and the Italian people.
This reaction hit not just Gaza, but the occupied West Bank. Settler attacks on Palestinian villages skyrocketed, and Israel's government approved the largest land seizure in 30 years.
But as cities in Gaza were razed to the ground, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faced increasing scrutiny from his own population as to how the 7th of October attack had gone undetected.
Hostage negotiations have seen 124 Israelis released, but 48 remain in Gaza, half of whom are believed to have been killed, after the government repeatedly squandered truce deals.
Hundreds of thousands of Israelis have attended weekly protests and nationwide strikes for the hostages' release, as well as calling for fresh elections. Still, Israel's government expanded its war, bombing Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, Iran, and Qatar.
As it did so, protests against its war on Gaza swept the world. Legal groups accused Israel of committing genocide. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and other leading members of both Israel's government and Hamas. Western allies grew critical of Israel's actions. Several would recognize a Palestinian state at the 2025 UN General Assembly, bringing the total to 157 out of 193 UN member states.
Calls to boycott Israel in Hollywood, Eurovision, and UEFA are gaining momentum. Yet Israel continued launching new offensives, most recently in Gaza City, despite under a third of Israelis supporting this.
2 years on, undeterred by protests within Israel or isolation without, Netanyahu has refused to end the war. Gaza lies in ruins, and Israel's top security brass say the military can achieve no more.
Last week, US President Trump unveiled what he called a peace plan for Gaza, demanding the immediate return of Israeli captives and opaque new leadership to replace Hamas. Now, polling shows Israelis overwhelmingly support the deal, though the details are yet to be ironed out. But even though Hamas has agreed to the preliminary plan, Israel has continued to bomb Gaza.
As the death toll skyrockets, why is Israel still fighting the longest war it has ever fought? And how is that war seen by the population in whose name and national security it is waged? 4 guests will help us answer these questions in today's special: Ofer Kassif, Daniel Levy, Shel Ben Ephraim, and David Hurst. First, we are diving into Israel's politics, and here to help is Israel's Member of Parliament, Ofer Kassif. Welcome, Ofer, to Middle East Eye.
Thank you very much for having me. Good evening.
Now, over the past 2 years, we've seen different justifications given by Israeli officials for the genocide in Gaza, but the most common one is the events of October the 7th. Hamas is ultimately responsible. Firstly, is this the case still? In Israel's political chamber, is October 7th still the main argument for the ongoing war?
Well, yes, that was an excuse. I wouldn't refer to it as an argument, let alone as a reason, because that's a sham. That's an excuse. As I've been saying for almost 2 years, I have to say, not in order to flatter myself, but in order to make the right analysis, which is a necessity in order to give the right solution. Already in an interview I gave on the 9th of October, 2023, I said that the terrible criminal massacre that committed Hamas, which is my comrades and I, Palestinians as Jews in Israel, in my party, the Communist Party and Hadash, we condemned it from the beginning. We're against this massacre, this criminal massacre. But we said, and I said from the beginning, that it was used only as an excuse and not as a reason. The excuse was that 7th of October necessitates release of the hostages, and before that, what the government said is to reject or to eliminate any kind of security threat. But from the very beginning, this genocide, those atrocities that are committed still by Israel have nothing to do with the Israeli security nor with the release of the hostages. It is the realization of the genocidal plan that was already introduced in 2017 by Smotrich, when it is entitled the Decisive Plan, and it was published all over the world in English as well, so you can even follow it. That was an excuse. The 7th of October, again, criminal massacre, has been used as an excuse to launch this genocide against the Palestinian people, nothing else.
You say that October the 7th was an excuse, not really the cause of what we're witnessing right now. But I believe you're one of a few voices only saying this inside the Parliament of Israel. Has that changed over the course of the war? Would you say you've gained any allies in Parliament for this view, or do you remain an outlier?
First of all, it's true. We've been in Hadash, the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, the only Jewish-Palestinian partnership in the parliament for many years. We were the only ones that from the beginning opposed the attack against Gaza and said that the only way to solve the issues that are at stake, including the release of the hostages, is a political solution, which means ending the occupation. But and we were totally isolated and persecuted like many others. In Israel, one should note that from the very beginning, people who raised an alternative voice to this genocidal attack, and even to the government, and even to Netanyahu as a person, have been accused in treason, in supporting Hamas, in terrorism support, in terrorism or support of terrorism, and we were totally isolated. I personally, in the last 2 years, have been suspended from the Knesset altogether almost 300 days because of my struggle in not only words but actions, but mainly words against the genocide. And that included the support of most of the opposition against me and against my comrades. So we were totally isolated. But as time went by, more and more people, especially in the streets and among the demonstrators and protesters, later on a bit more in the Knesset, but much less, began to understand that what we were saying from the beginning bears some, rationale, and that it has nothing to do with the security of Israel, which is entitled to security. Nobody can undermine that or challenge that. We want to live in security, but we also know that the Palestinians need security and that the two communities are dependent upon each other in their security and future. So now you can see, especially as I said in the streets, more and more people, protesters, including among the families of the hostages and the victims on the Israeli part, that understand that this terrible attack, this genocide, which is often regarded as a war, I don't agree with the title, but that's not the point right now, began to understand and say so, that should stop. And you can see it even among some people on the right. For instance, the ex-chief of staff, Moshe Ya'alon, Bogi Ya'alon, who was the chief of staff and also the defense minister in Netanyahu's government in the past already said himself and joined in almost 600 ex-generals that Israel is guilty in war crimes and ethnic cleansing. And obviously you can see it more and hear it more among journalists and professors, teachers, social workers, physicians, etc., and the public at large. You can see a change, definitely. Perhaps it's too late, it's too little, it's not to the extent that I would like to see it, but still, it's better than nothing and never. There is a change. More and more people, now I can say absolutely that in the millions of people in Israel believe that this genocide should stop. And I hope it will.
So I gather you're gathering some more political allies in your criticism of the war. Nevertheless, it remains a very tense climate to speak out. Just a couple of months ago, one of your colleagues, I believe, was assaulted by far-right Israelis for his criticism of the war.
I was with him in the same place. We both were assaulted, almost lynched.
Yes, Ayman Odeh, he was assaulted, and I wonder how it is for you speaking up in the Knesset as a critic of the war. Do you feel free? Do you feel safe to do so?
Absolutely not. The violence toll in the streets, as well as within the Knesset, is on the rise all the time. As I said, my friend and comrade Ayman Odeh and myself, we were in a town 10 minutes from where I live, together. We went for a demonstration against the genocide, in where we were almost lynched under the auspices of the police, which didn't do anything to stop those the pogroms, the mob. So, and there are so many other examples. It's not only directed against members of the Knesset like us, but also I can give you another two examples very briefly. One is that you know that every year there is the commemoration day, which is officially the commemoration day for soldiers and terror victims within Israel. And there is an alternative ceremony for many years now, which is common to Palestinians and Israelis together to commemorate all the victims of the occupation and the hatred and the conflict, so to speak. And this year, the participants, there were so many participants that there was no enough space for everybody. So they screened the ceremony in different places. And one of those places in the city of Ra'anana, which is a bit northern than Tel Aviv, it was screened in a synagogue, which was attacked by a fascist mob who broke windows, etc., of a synagogue. We all remember where such things happened. And so there was a pogrom. And again, the police didn't do anything to stop it and didn't arrest anyone, and not to mention charge anyone. And another example happened about a month ago, or perhaps even less than that, when a protest tent by the Knesset in Jerusalem that was put there 2 years ago by a father of someone who was killed during the massacre of October 7th, and this tent is identified more with the left side of the political spectrum. It was attacked, and again, by a fascist mob, and the people who were in the tent called the police, and for 90 minutes, the police refrained from coming to protect them. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. There are many hundreds, if not thousands, examples. By the way, this is a penetration of the daily pogroms by fascist mobs against the Palestinians in the West Bank. And because they are not sanctioned, they are not stopped and arrested, they allow themselves and their collaborators and supporters within Israel proper, allow themselves to follow suit, because they know they can do whatever they like against people like us. And they continue, and within the Knesset as well. As I said, I personally was suspended in the last 2 years, almost for one entire year altogether. And same about my comrades. Ayman Odeh himself was suspended altogether for a few months, Aida Tuma Sliman as well. So there are attempts to silence us. We can, one hand is killing in Gaza and in the West Bank, and the other hand of the establishment is put over our mouth to shut us up. But we won't do that. We won't be silenced. We continue our struggle for the future and well-being of both peoples of this land.
Ofer, final question. You paint a picture of this silencing of critics, especially during the war. Israel has not only faced 2 years of war, it's faced 2 years of an emergency wartime government. Calls for elections have been shut down, calls to end the war have been shut down. How has this period impacted democratic institutions and democratic freedoms inside Israel?
Well, as I already said, the silencing attempts, the chilling effect of that, and the attempts to just, eliminate any alternative voice to the genocidal policy of the government, which is, alas, supported by many segments of the opposition, are under threat. People, so to speak, common citizens, by hundreds, were fired from the workplaces or thrown out from the studies at the universities or colleges because they raised a voice against the genocide or because they expressed sympathy for the children of Gaza. And there's a lot of violence by the police, for instance, which turned into a private militia in the hands of the government and especially of the so-called national security minister. And again, as I said, those examples are only the tip of the iceberg. There are, and of course, there are also some laws and bills against basic civil and political rights. For instance, the freedom of the press is not only under threat, it's already partly eliminated. Same about the freedom of the judicial system. So we are talking about a full-fledged fascist regime that already exists in Israel. As was published a few weeks ago in Haaretz, we are not on the road to fascism. We are deep in the abyss of fascism already.
Ofer Kassif, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a window into Israel's parliament.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Now, next up, we'll zoom in a little closer to the individual parties and politicians driving Israel's war.
Here to discuss the motivations of the government at the helm of these political changes is British-Israeli analyst and former negotiator Daniel Levy. Daniel,
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us on MEELive.
Of course.
So we've seen now the announcement of Trump's peace plan that Netanyahu has approved. There have been several ceasefire proposals over the course of this war. What has driven him to accept this one in particular, and why?
Well, first, let's understand what it is we're talking about. And the word peace plan, I don't think, is something that captures what has been put forward by the US administration. What you have is, I think, three things there. One is something that could conceivably bring, and that's really important, a ceasefire, an Israeli military withdrawal, release of hostages, release of Palestinian prisoners being held in Israel, the ramping up of the desperately needed humanitarian assistance. That's one basket. That's what's being discussed in Cairo right now, but it lacks detail. It lacks the guarantees that you're going to get to those phases of Israeli withdrawal, of humanitarian access. Then there are two other parts to it. One is to impose some kind of weird 21st century version of a colonial administration inside Gaza, headed by President Trump himself, Tony Blair and others. And then the third part, which is almost non-existent, is this idea that it will lead to peace, Palestinian statehood. West Bank isn't even mentioned in the plan. I say this because it helps you understand why it is easier for the Israeli prime minister, given his political circumstances, to accept. So that's one thing that's going on. But we should understand that even in nominally accepting such a half-baked and stacked in Israel's favor so-called plan, Netanyahu has already contradicted things in that plan and set his own version of it forward. He has said, contrary to what's written in the paper, there'll be no Palestinian state. And he has said, contrary to what's written in the paper, that the IDF will remain in the vast majority of Gaza. So I don't think we can say that this has Netanyahu's sign-off. I think Netanyahu is saying, look, if you can get Hamas to give the hostages back with limited deliverables on my part, why not? Anyway, I can go ahead and violate it later. And I think he's saying to his coalition allies, stay in the government, we'll be back killing Gazans, to put it bluntly, very quickly.
And we know, of course, that getting those hostages back is a top priority for Israeli society. Other elements of the plan, not so much. We know, for example, very little support for a Palestinian state. How are Israelis looking at the plan, looking at any potential concessions to Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere? Obviously, we know that Israel is due to hold elections next year. I wonder how that public reaction is factoring into the Premier's thinking.
Look, I think there is polarization, division, fragmentation in Israeli society. I wish I could tell you that centers around Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and whether indeed Israeli Jewish security can be achieved by imposing maximum insecurity and suffering on Palestinians. That's not the fault line. The fault line is, are you prioritizing the release, the return of the Israelis? Mr. Prime Minister, are you allowing, even by our standards, some extreme ministers to set the agenda? And so one of the things that Netanyahu will be testing constantly is how much maneuver room does he have with his coalition allies? Are they going to bring him down? Is he going to have to rely on the opposition? Is this perhaps going to be popular? Does the narrative that he offered Israelis on Saturday night, which is, this is part of my total victory, this is another victory, I've bent the will of the Americans and the region to my direction, is that going to play well? Because in the polls, he continues to lag behind the opposition, and he hasn't managed to close that gap until now. What I think is significant to understand is that you don't have an Israeli opposition coming to this and saying, we need a whole different approach to the Palestinians. You have an opposition which mostly consists of people who have served under Netanyahu in the past, some of whom have been deeply part of his own Likud party, some of whom have been part of the national religious settler movement. And if you look at the opposition leaders, Bennett, Lapid, Lieberman, Gantz, that applies to all of them. There is the leader of the small rump of what remains of the Labour Party called the Democrats, Yair Golan, to whom that does not apply. But we are not seeing a division in Israel in terms of a peace camp and a war camp. It's two versions of a war camp, largely speaking.
I wonder then, you mentioned a lack of political imagination across the aisle. I wonder then, where does Israel go from here? Because there's been this kind of recognition that the containment or management of the occupation pre-October 7th simply has not worked as a formula. But then there seems to be a lack of vision for what lies ahead. And in the meantime, as you say, a lot of polarization. We saw a sharp increase in emigration from Israel in 2024, one that far outstripped immigration into the country, obviously extremely torn over the fate of the remaining hostages, over the military draft. So there seem to be a lot of open questions in Israeli society. I wonder then, where does the nation go from there?
Well, it's deeply disturbing because it appears to be in a society in the grip of a genocidal doom loop. I mean, it's the manufacturing of consent around such extreme actions which we have to look at. So the media, the political class, who are critical of Netanyahu, are still repeating his narrative that this is all because of Hamas, that there is food, it's just Hamas isn't letting it get to Palestinians. It's Hamas's embeddedness in the civilian population which has led to this level of casualties when they acknowledge that there has been that level of casualties. So there's no real critique, real questioning of the fundamentals of this being cruel collective punishment, cruel, disproportionate mass killing of civilians, the ethnic cleansing, the displacement. You have the formal leader of the opposition, Lapid, who even talks about voluntary transfer as one of the things that will need to still be on the agenda. Of course, there's nothing voluntary when you've destroyed everything. So the lack of imagination, I fear, does not apply to much of Netanyahu's own political class, because they have a very vibrant if terrifying imagination. And that imagination takes you to this genocidal, ethnic cleansing, total victory tilt. But the other part of the political map are basically saying, let's go back to containment. And so what you see is essentially this choice between genocide or apartheid is what's on offer. And it's breaking that. It's offering Israelis something different, which of course exists amongst dissidents, amongst some of those who are protesting, some in the human rights community who've called this what it is, some who have called from sanctions, but those feel like quite lonely voices. And the question is whether that can be broken if Israelis see a different incentive structure. If they see that this is not sustainable, Netanyahu has managed, and one has to acknowledge this, to get through this with the economy largely intact. He's run a form of military Keynesianism where he's put he's put money in people's pockets by ramping up the compensation that reservists receive. He had a relatively small debt to GDP ratio going into this, so he's flooded the economy with money, largely through giving such great compensation to reservists, which has been another way of manufacturing consent. But what if the incentive structure changed? What if that isolation which he warned of and which he clearly fears, and he even went back out again and said, it's not us who's isolated, it's Hamas. What if that isolation actually took practical, consequential forms in terms of Israel's trade, in terms of where Israelis can visit visa-free, in terms of Israeli participation in international tournaments? That's the thing that could break the grip that this genocidal doom loop has on Israeli society, because it could change the nature of the conversation. I'm not saying Israelis would say, hey, thank you so much for sanctioning us, but I think they would say, is this working for us? Is this good for us? Do we need to look outside of the alternatives of genocide and apartheid in terms of the political options that we should be considering?
So you see the thing that could remove, should we say, the grip that Netanyahu's political narrative has over the majority of Israeli society as coming from outside consequences, outside repercussions for their actions. It will not come from inventiveness within the Israeli political spectrum, at least for the majority.
I think it's the interaction between those two things. I think we can say at this stage with a significant degree of confidence, and you spoke to Ofer Kassif and he was describing the internal situation there. I think we can say with significant confidence that it's not going to be self-propelled. It's not going to be generated from inside Israeli society. So there is going to have to be this push and pull. And what Israelis, I think, have experienced, have lived, is cost-free extremism, that they could go on this journey to these genocidal policies and be treated with impunity. When that changes, perhaps a new possibility will emerge in Israeli politics, in Israeli society, in the Israeli discourse, one that we don't see today. Of course, one of the big challenges is how do you do that when you have a dysfunctional and divided Palestinian side? Because if we cautiously make a South African analogy here, when Prime Minister P.W. Botha in 1979, Prime Minister then of the apartheid regime in South Africa, said, off the back of Soweto and other uprisings, we must adapt or die. He made some cosmetic changes, but it was the ability of the ANC to translate those changes into real challenges to the regime that ultimately led to apartheid's demise. In the absence of a unified, representative, strategic Palestinian challenge, all of this also becomes so much more difficult.
Yes, clearly a lot has to change in the Palestinian, Israeli and global landscape to get to that new possibility you're talking about. Daniel Levy, a British-Israeli analyst and former negotiator, thank you so much for speaking to MEE Live this evening.